systematic ambiguity of symbolism can also make it problematic, such as the very telling removal of the final stone, presumably the stone honoring the shooter. And he too was, in a way, a victim of this psychic meltdown. And it reminded me that much the same happened in the wake of Columbine, that trees honoring the students who died initially included 2 trees for the shooters, which were cut down, presumably by families or others enraged at the sense that they would have any recognition beyond contempt. As I listened to other aspects of this, your telling presentation, I was struck by how grieving is something that occurs not only within us, but between us. It is an act as well as a feeling. And as is the attempt to reweave some fabric of meaning in the aftermath of this being rendered by this kind of experience. And I think that for this community, our community of constructivists who sometimes feature meaning as something that happens in the mind of the beholder, I think it's a useful corrective to see meaning making as something that unfolds socially as well as in our hearts and minds as we collectively try to wrap our arms around these kinds of events. The idea of meaning making in action, I thought, was beautifully conveyed by the run walk that surprised you with the massive turnout as people looked for some way to literally move through this event together in solidarity, to claim a kind of what my friend Vinchuti would call a kind of social capital that's greatly needed at such a time as this. The idea as well that, again, the ironies around this are worth underscoring, the way in which in constructing the permanent memorials, then you also are, and in dealing with the spontaneous ones, like the 10,000 cranes that are offered, you also need to, in some way, find, in terms of a British sociologist named Tony Walter, a way to police grief. Like, how will one place boundaries around personal expression when the goal is also collective memorialization? And so it just sensitizes us how there is no single approved procedure for doing so that requires social negotiation, collective goodwill, attempts at understanding the perspectives of others and honoring them. And in the, as you kind of evoke the image of the cranes, and I guess these were origami cranes.
Correct.
Yeah, very striking kind of image. I was struck by how, as we go about the process of making meaning of loss, we typically do so by inscribing it in some kind of tradition that has meaning, and a meaning that certainly goes deeper and farther back than any single human life, so that we spontaneously or consciously end up drawing on different spiritual traditions, on wisdom traditions, that somehow give our local suffering a broader kind of significance and offer a kind of solace. And of course, doing that in a way that is sensitive to differences in belief systems and not specifically aligned with one in the way that will exclude others is part of the challenge of what we must face. And I'd be really interested to hear some stories about that. Finally, you're mentioning, in a way I'd not expected, I didn't know about the involvement of the Amish in the recognition of the tragedy on the campus. Ironically, as you say, in fall of 2007, I happened to be presenting a 2-day workshop on grief in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, 2 weeks before that shooting. And it just
2006.
Yeah, 2006. It reminded me of just how intricately our lives are threaded together with tragedies that keep coming, and we can be sure they will continue to do so. So the final thing that really struck me was how it was the duty of the kind of collective passing on of memorial objects to form a kind of thread of solidarity, if you will, across different communities affected by this kind of violence.
Right.
So I find myself intrigued, moved, stimulated by what you had to say, and I just want to learn a lot more about it.
Well, why don't we just open it up to questions
Yep.
that folks may have? Or I could just talk, but I'd probably be better with the questions. Please.
One thing I found amazing, but also a little bit of shock and offense at in the aftermath of Virginia Tech. At my own university, there was just a flurry of panic of new emergency procedures.
Yes.
And much of that seemed to be sort of litigation management. If this happened here, we might be legally liable for X, Y, and Z if we don't do everything we can to show that we prevent this. And it seems like, I mean, something intrinsic to tragedy is the idea it's not predictable and preventable, but there seemed to be some implicit victim blaming in this flurry of we're going to be sure this something similar doesn't happen here, that I found a bit distasteful. But I just wondered if you have a perspective on it.
Well, yeah, I do. I think you're right. By definition, crises are events for which we do not have adequate resources and have not had adequate foresight. That's what they are. If you think you can eliminate crises from human life, probably want to read more history. But nonetheless, some of the steps that people took in the aftermath of the shootings on our campus probably were helpful. The police response at NIU was probably improved because of our experience. I also think, well, one of the first things the folks at NIU did is call us. You know, and I think the day of or after the shootings, I was on the phone with the Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs, talking with, you know, and they set up their own version of our office. Did some things differently, based in part on just being a different community, but based in part too on mistakes we've made and shared with them. So some of those steps can be helpful. They're not all futile or just empty gestures, but it's very hard to know which are until something happens.
And I understand some of that is the need to make meaning of tragedy, and so does that depart from this?
Yeah.
But,
Well, a lot of the, you know, and I think the other thing that is very clear if you do study any of these kinds of events, the deliberate, intentional mass tragedies, these guys study each other's work. They planned very carefully. Cho had 400 rounds still in his backpack when he killed himself. I think he fired 200 or something, I can't remember. Most victims were shot more than once. I mean, there even was a report, because he had gone to the Montgomery County shooting range in the weeks before the shooting, that he was practicing shooting down at the ground, not up at target. These guys are very deliberate. They know what they're doing. And they're not crazy. They are angry as hell. And about the only flaw in their thinking is that somehow they'll witness, you know, in some form, the pain that they've inflicted. They don't get to do that usually, because they usually end up killing themselves or being killed. But they're not crazy. Angry as hell. angrier than, than I've ever seen anybody. But they're students, they're scholars of each other's work. They often plan to memorialize or in some way celebrate their predecessors. They check out anniversaries of shootings, each other's shootings. They are not fooling around. You can take all the precautions you want, and they will absolutely have figured them all out. Now that, for example, the big talk was why, after the shootings on our campus, why didn't they lock down the campus after the first shootings? Well, if they had, Joe would have been locked in a room or a building with everybody else. That would have stopped him. That would have helped him. It's kind of like, why did the terrorists fly the airplanes into the World Trade Towers? Well, because it was a very easy thing to do. There are always lots of easy ways to kill people. We're lucky that more people don't take advantage of that, but it's always a risk of being alive. And there are people out there